light up here.
He checked amidst the boxes and other items, but saw no one there.
I don't see anything up here.
We didn't have a real just cause to do an intensive search of the residence. We searched for, obviously, any sign that someone had been kidnapped, in places where someone could secrete a human body, just to be on the safe side.
Investigators left, still suspicious. But without a warrant, they were unable to do a more thorough search. Investigators turned their attention back to Lisa's brothers, Neil and Stanfield.
We felt that it was drug-related, and we told Neil and Stanfield that we're not interested in their current legal problems, but that we feel like Lisa's life may be at stake, and that we need to have all the information that they can provide us to help get their sister back.
The day after the kidnapping, investigators again interviewed Neil and Stanfield. Despite their pending drug charges, Lisa's brothers finally came clean. They described a bogus drug deal that they'd taken part in a few days before.
What's up, man?
The brothers said that they had met with two men, but claimed they only knew the one named Steve.
9 pounds, right? Yeah.
Steve and his partner had given them $5,000 to score 9 pounds of marijuana.
How long it gonna take?
Neil and Stanfield promised they would return in an hour with the drugs, but they never did.
Right?
They now admitted they had never intended to deliver the marijuana. They just needed the money for attorney's fees because of their pending drug charges. Lisa's brothers said they didn't know how to contact Steve, but they knew someone who did. And that was all the brothers would say. The man who knew Steve was an inmate serving an 8-year sentence at the Tarrant County Jail. He revealed that Steve's full name was Stephen Beckley, a 19-year-old who worked detailing cars at a dealership in Irving, Texas.
West Wing Auto Shop, where's that at?
Investigators ran a computer check on Beckley. He had no outstanding warrants and no criminal history. As investigators continued to work the case, Lisa's sister, Pearl, did all she could to help. She hung up missing persons flyers and contacted local media, hoping someone might have seen Lisa. But the chance of finding her sister alive grew dimmer with each passing day. On September 24th, 1994, 16-year-old Lisa Renee was kidnapped from her Arlington, Texas apartment.
Who are you? I'm the FBI. Oh, they're the FBI. Open the door. No, we talk. They're the FBI. They said they're the FBI, ma'am. No! Ma'am? What's going on? Ma'am?
Just over 2 days had passed since Lisa's desperate call for help. Local police and the FBI were no closer to finding the missing girl. With time running out, the Arlington Police Department asked the public for help. Detective Stanton recalls the response was tremendous.
It was truly something that brought out the public and the public's fears about being abducted out of your own residence. It's sort of something that you're not expecting in a community like Arlington. It's not something that's ordinary. This doesn't happen here, I would say, ever in a town like ours.
On September 27th, the Arlington police detective received an unexpected visitor. He was the owner of the Irving, Texas home that police had searched in connection with the champagne-colored Cadillac. He was at work during the search, but had since heard the news of Lisa's disappearance and believed he had information that might be helpful. He said that the day before the kidnapping, he threw a barbecue since his wife's brothers were staying with him for a few days. The oldest brother, Orlando Hall, was involved with drugs. His younger brother, Demetrius Hall, shared the same interest. Their friend Stephen Beckley joined them.
When the husband told us that the Hall brothers were dressed in camouflage clothing, it made him know that after having heard the news stories, his brothers-in-law could very well be connected to the kidnapping case.
Something else had sparked the man's suspicions. One of his neighbors said she saw several young men drive up to the house in his Cadillac. At that time, he and his wife were out for dinner using a different car. But the Cadillac's keys were kept in the hall, so it was possible his wife's brothers had borrowed it. The man said he'd never trusted the Hall brothers.
Come here, you.
Both had served time in Arkansas on drug charges.
Come here, son. Come here. Come here.
And by visiting their sister in Irving, Texas, they were in violation of their
I know
parole.
you ain't right. Put it out. Whatever's right.
The man sensed they were up to something new, but didn't know what. He added that the Hall brothers were no longer staying at his house. On the night of the kidnapping, only Orlando had slept in the house, but he flew back to Arkansas early the next morning, planning to stay with friends in the town of El Dorado. The detective suspected Orlando had probably joined the others there. He contacted the El Dorado, Arkansas police. Investigators discovered that 19-year-old Demetrius Hall was on parole for possession of cocaine with intent to distribute. His older brother, Orlando Hall, was on parole for the same offense. His record also included arrests for aggravated assault and carrying a weapon.
When I spoke to the people in El Dorado, they were aware of the Hall family. In fact, they were providing to me information about the Hall brothers before I could even give them the information about the Hall brothers. They were well known to law enforcement in the community.
Later that day, investigators obtained a warrant to more thoroughly search the Irving, Texas home where the Hall brothers had been staying. They scoured the house for hair, fibers, blood, fingerprints, and anything else that might be connected to the crime. FBI Special Agent Garrett Floyd remembers their most significant discovery.
In the children's room, we found a souvenir miniature baseball bat. When you pick up an item and you can see glass embedded in it, and you know that the sliding pane window was glass, then you make a decision on the spot, and you believe that evidence is a part of the crime scene.
Lab tests would determine whether his hunch was correct. In a storage container found in a bedroom closet, investigators discovered a green knit shirt with insulation fibers on it. They bagged it for further analysis. They also took samples of insulation fibers from the attic. Lab tests would later reveal that they matched the fibers on the shirt. A pair of camouflage pants was also found in the attic. Forensic technicians processed the champagne-colored Cadillac at the police impound lot. They found no fingerprints relevant to the case. They did discover a few small glass fragments inside the car, possibly from Lisa's sliding glass door. They sent the fragments to the lab for analysis. As they waited for the results, agents obtained arrest warrants for the Hall brothers and their friend Stephen Beckley, since they already had enough to establish probable cause. But they still hadn't found Lisa Renee. Agent Floyd continued to work around the clock, knowing that with each hour, they were less likely to find her alive.
We were very motivated in solving this case, in as much that we knew that time was critical. All of our efforts were focused on the recovery of the victim.
Investigators hoped they could pick up Lisa's trail, a trail that ended with broken glass. Technicians compared glass fragments from the car and those embedded in the baseball bat to shards collected from Lisa's home. At the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C., Supervisory Special Agent and Forensic Examiner Bruce Hall attempted to confirm that all the glass had come from the same sliding glass door. Technicians examined the glass embedded in the baseball bat. They tested the composition of the glass. It was consistent with the glass collected at Lisa's apartment. To confirm their results, they also tested its refractive index, the degree to which light bends as it passes through the sample.
After characterizing the glass recovered from the crime scene and characterizing the glass recovered from the baseball bat, I found that the glass on the baseball bat had the same refractive index and same composition as the glass at the crime scene. That led me to the conclusion that the glass on the baseball bat had originated from the crime scene.
The glass found in the Cadillac did not match. It was determined to have come from a window previously broken on the car. At the request of the FBI and Arlington, Texas police, El Dorado, Arkansas detectives tracked down the fugitives. They found 19-year-old Demetrius Hall at his father's house in El Dorado. He surrendered peacefully and was taken to the El Dorado jail. But he refused to say anything about Lisa's whereabouts. The search of the house revealed nothing. What investigators still didn't know was where Lisa was and whether she was dead or alive. 4.5 days after 16-year-old Lisa Renee was kidnapped from her sister's apartment in Arlington, Texas, investigators had tracked two abductors to El Dorado, Arkansas. One of the three suspects, Demetrius Hall, was in custody. Investigators continued to search for his older brother, Orlando, and a third man named Stephen Beckley. That afternoon, police found Stephen Beckley at a friend's house. The officers didn't even have to knock. Beckley came out and gave himself up. FBI agents and detectives from Arlington flew to El Dorado to interview the suspects. Stephen Beckley was initially uncooperative. He refused to say where Lisa Renee was or whether she was still alive.
I'm losing my patience with you right now.
Special Agent Garrett Floyd refused to give up.
Mr. Beckley advised that he did not know a whole lot of information concerning what was going on. After about an hour of talking to him, he looked at me and we developed somewhat of a relationship and we started to talk.
Beckley said that he and his friends had called in a fourth man named Bruce Webster to help them exact their revenge on Lisa Renee's brothers. Webster was a convicted felon and had a violent reputation as a hitman. Their plan was to douse Lisa Renee's brothers in gasoline and ignite it if they didn't turn over the drugs or the money as they had promised. When the men arrived at Lisa Renee's apartment, her brothers were not home. Unwilling to leave empty-handed, they kidnapped her instead. Beckley said that he and the other three took Lisa to the house in Irving, Texas, where Demetrius and Orlando were staying. They transferred the teenage girl from the Cadillac to Beckley's Ford Escort.
Get off the car.
Stephen Beckley, Bruce Webster, and 19-year-old Demetrius Hall drove her to Arkansas. Orlando Hall stayed behind and hid in his sister's attic. Detective Stanton was frustrated. Police had been within a few feet of Orlando Hall. and missed him.
It wasn't until later that we learned, after we had taken some people into custody, that Orlando had been indeed hiding in the attic insulation while we were downstairs talking to the lady of the house.
Beckley said that during the 4-hour drive to Arkansas, he and the other two had taken turns raping Lisa Renee. When they arrived in Arkansas that night, Webster booked a motel room in Pine Bluff. Lisa was kept bound and gagged in the bathroom.
I'm trying to find him.
Agents pushed Beckley to tell them if the girl was still alive and where she was. Every minute counted if they were to save her life. But Beckley wouldn't say. He claimed he was afraid to talk as long as Bruce Webster was on the loose.
In his mind, he thought, believed, knew that Bruce Webster would kill him or anyone else if they ever divulged the information of what had occurred to Lisa Renee. That's the fear that Bruce Webster had instilled in the individuals as part of his kidnapping.
If I say a word...
Beckley did tell investigators where to look for Webster. The ex-convict might still be at the motel in Pine Bluff where they had held Lisa Renee 4 days ago. Investigators headed to the motel to confront a man Beckley had described as a violent hitman. Pine Bluff was 90 miles from El Dorado. Agents spoke with the manager to confirm Beckley's story. They hoped they would find Webster there, as well as Lisa Renee.
Upon interviewing the innkeeper, we were able to determine that Bruce Webster had registered at that inn, and that during the time he was registering, a young lady attempted to get out of the car, and that Bruce turned to the other occupants in the car and says, "Put the bitch back in the car." Bruce Webster and his companions then drove to the back of the property and went into the room.
The manager also remembered seeing 2 other black males in the car, but she couldn't make out their faces.
Nobody said anything last
She
night.
showed investigators the registration log for September 25th. Webster had been in room 513. The room was rented and cleaned several times after the men checked out. Chances of finding any useful evidence were slim. An FBI emergency response team was called in. The agent and detective continued to interview Beckley. They asked him for details of what went on in the room, hoping he would break down and tell them where Lisa was now.
Once we got Mr. Beckley to this Pine Bluff motel, the urgency was there in that we thought that she was still alive because Mr. Beckley assured us the last time he saw her, she was alive and she was at this inn.
Okay. Beckley told police that the men had raped Lisa repeatedly in the bathroom. Otherwise, they had kept her hooded with a paper bag over her head. During their second night at the motel, the kidnappers were nearly discovered. A security guard knocked at the door.
The innkeeper asked that their on-residence security guard who lived there check the room to see if everything was all right. The security guard did check the room and did not see Lisa Renee within the room. Stephen Beckley advised that had he seen her, that they were going to kill the security guard.
Beckley and the others were afraid that the guard might return. The motel was no longer a safe place to hide. As the kidnapper told his story, forensic technicians worked to confirm that Lisa had in fact been in the room. But after hours of painstaking work, they still had no evidence that Lisa had been there or that she was still alive. 6 days after 16-year-old Lisa Renee was kidnapped from her Arlington, Texas apartment, the FBI was no closer to finding her or 2 remaining suspects. Although investigators had found no evidence to indicate that Lisa had been in a Pine Bluff motel room, confessed kidnapper Stephen Beckley assured them she had. Forensic technician Joel Stevenson of the Arlington, Texas Police Department was determined to find something that would corroborate Beckley's story.
We went in knowing that possibly sexual assaults had occurred in that motel room, multiple sexual assaults. We went into the motel room looking for body fluids that may tie the suspects to the motel room or Lisa to the motel room.
If Lisa and her kidnappers had left behind any evidence, it appeared to have been destroyed by the motel's housekeepers. The technicians didn't give up. They continued their meticulous search for hairs, fibers, and fingerprints. Finally, their persistence paid off.
It wasn't until we got into the bathroom and the wall behind the toilet is where we located the palm prints and fingerprints that were ultimately identified as belonging to Lisa Renee. So the palm print itself, placing Lisa with them in that same motel room, was very important. It was a very critical piece of putting her with them.
Investigators now had evidence that Lisa was alive 4 days earlier, the day Beckley and the others had checked in. As agents drove the kidnapper 90 miles back to the El Dorado jail, they pressed Beckley for more details. He admitted that after Orlando Hall had joined them in Pine Bluff, they decided to move Lisa to another motel nearby in order to avoid a second visit by the security guard. After a couple of days in that motel, the men grew increasingly concerned about getting caught. They came up with a plan to dispose of the girl. Demetrius Hall stayed behind to wipe the room clean, while the other three loaded her into Webster's car and headed for a rural area. Beckley told investigators that Bruce Webster and Orlando Hall had dug a grave in a nature preserve near the motel. They took Lisa there to kill her. But in the dark, overgrown park, the three men couldn't find the burial site. After an hour, they took her back to the motel. The next morning, they searched for the gravesite again. While forensic technicians scoured the second motel room for clues, investigators pressured Beckley to tell them what happened next. Special Agent Garrett Floyd recalls that Beckley refused, still afraid that Webster might seek retribution.
We were pressed for time because the clock was still ticking. We were hoping against hope that she was still alive. And so with this in mind, agents as well as police officers who had not slept in 2 or 3 days were up searching, looking, hoping that she was still alive.
Then, investigators got the call they'd been hoping for. The FBI emergency response team, working at the second motel, had spotted Bruce Webster pull up in his car. The suspected kidnapper had returned to the motel with a young woman, but she was not Lisa Renee. A brief interview revealed she was not connected to the crime in any way.
You're not in any trouble. It's going to be okay, okay? Just let me call him.
He had driven up into the parking lot. Our officers and the FBI agents confronted him. He identified himself as Bruce Webster, gave date of birth information. He was carrying a small baggie of what appeared to be marijuana in his pocket. He was asked if we could search his vehicle. He allowed the officers to search his vehicle that he'd driven up in.
Inside the vehicle, agents found 2 handguns. They charged Webster with possession of the guns and the marijuana and took him to the Garland County Jail in Hot Springs, Arkansas. The car was processed for other evidence. They found no trace of the missing girl.
And when they radioed us and told us he was in custody, we, myself, and Detective Ford went back and interviewed Bruce Webster. He stated that he didn't know anything. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was simply coming back to his motel room.
As Agent Floyd continued to pressure Webster for answers, the last of the fugitives, Orlando Hall, turned himself in.
Orlando Hall had apparently seen the news that these arrests had been made, found out, of course, that his brother had been taken into custody. He surrendered to the Pine Bluff Police Department.
With all 4 suspects now in custody, agents hoped that one of them would reveal where investigators could find Lisa Renee. The interview with Bruce Webster, the man who had been hired to do the killing, continued into the night, but he said little. Agent Floyd believed Webster had the answers they were looking for.
Basically, the only information Mr. Webster provided was his name, the fact that he hadn't done anything, and the fact that he wanted to go to sleep. To him, it was nothing. She was nothing.
Agents' hope of finding Lisa alive was fading. They needed to get one of the suspects to talk, and they needed to do it fast. Six days after a young woman was abducted from her Arlington, Texas apartment, investigators pressed her suspected kidnappers for information. Until now, alleged hitman Bruce Webster had stonewalled investigators. But Special Agent Garrett Floyd's persistence eventually paid off. Webster finally admitted that Lisa was dead.
It felt like a tremendous sledgehammer falling on you. We had tracked this young lady from Arlington, Texas to Pine Bluff, Arkansas, over 200 miles, with the one hope of finding her alive. And we did not. It was as if all of the wind and all of the energy had gone out of us.
Webster picked up the story where his accomplice Stephen Beckley left off. When they returned to the park with Lisa, they located the grave they had dug the day before. Detective John Stanton's fears had been realized.
The reality of it set in at that point that we were not going to find her alive. We were not going to be able to save her. We were going to be too late.
Stand by the car. Watch
Webster said that only 2 of his accomplices, Orlando Hall and Stephen Beckley, took Lisa back to the park. The 4th kidnapper, Demetrius Hall, had stayed behind to clean the motel room and wipe away fingerprints. The suspected hitman claimed he wasn't actually with the others when they killed the girl. Webster said he returned to the car to act as the lookout. From the car, the grave was too far away to have seen the murder. Now that Webster was safely in custody, the agents decided to see if Beckley would corroborate his story. Agent Floyd felt that Beckley knew far more than he had said.
And he looked at me and he said, "You know I didn't tell you everything. You know I've lied." And I said, "Yes, I know you did not tell me everything. You didn't lie, but you didn't tell me everything." And he said, "You're right." So then Stephen Beckley started crying. And Stephen Beckley told me she was dead, that she was buried in these woods, and that we needed to go get her. And I said, "We will go get her. Let's get your story on paper, and we will go and find her."
Crazy, man. He's a hitman.
Beckley said that despite Bruce Webster's story, the hitman had indeed been involved in the killing.
He told us a story that the grave was 6 foot deep, and that when she went to the grave, when she, Bruce Webster, Orlando Hall, and he, Stephen Beckley, arrived at the grave, that she saw the grave, and that she started to run in the effort to get away. And that they struck at her with a shovel and placed a mark in this tree. That he, Beckley, became concerned and was afraid and ran back up to the street to check to see if the way was clear, as he was instructed to by Bruce Webster. By the time he came back, they were burying her.
What you asked for?
Beckley told investigators that the men then met Demetrius back at the motel, showered, and left. They gave their dirty clothes to Webster, who burned them in the park, along with Lisa's blood-stained outfit. Webster stayed in Pine Bluff with Orlando Hall, while the other two returned to El Dorado. The agent re-interviewed Webster, hoping Beckley's confession would give him some leverage. The agent told him that Beckley had placed him at the murder scene and named the park where the body was buried.
He stated that he didn't know anything about anything. The last thing that I told him was, everyone else has told me what has occurred. Why won't you? And he said, they're family, aren't they? And I said, yep, the family has turned on you. He said, open that book. Let me tell you what happened.
The hitman now confessed that he was, in fact, at the murder scene. He admitted that he had dug the grave, and he offered to show it to the agent.
So in the middle of the night, we drove back to Pine Bluff and told him I need as many flashlights and officers and agents available, that we were going to find her tonight.
Webster showed investigators the area of the park where the body was buried. They searched for evidence to corroborate the suspect's stories. By morning, they found the gravesite. They began to process the area and exhume the body. The site was as the hitman had described it, right down to a damaged tree near the grave.
And we removed a section of that tree because it was evidence that the shovel that they were hitting her with had actually missed on one of their swings and hit the tree. So we used that tree as a part of the evidence.
Unearthing the body was a time-consuming and heartbreaking process. Besides digging, investigators sifted through leaves and dirt, searching for anything that might help tie the suspects to the crime. Joel Stevenson of the Arlington, Texas Police recalls the moment when their hard work finally paid off.
We made contact with Lisa's body approximately 2 feet down from the surface, the outer surface of the dirt, and then started uncovering her and really excavating around the body from that point on down to the 4 feet level. This lasted for about 5.5 hours. It took us to fully extract her from the gravesite.
When they reached the dead woman's body, it was an emotional moment for investigators who wanted so desperately to save Lisa Renee.
During the time we were exhuming her body, one of the agents on the evidence response team accidentally scrapes her knee. The agent breaks down. And I break down. Because we know now that she's dead. This week that we have spent trying to locate her has resulted in the recovery of her, but not the recovery of her in that she was not alive.
The coroner removed Lisa's body to the Arkansas State Lab in Little Rock, where an autopsy was performed. She had ligature marks on her arms, defensive wounds on her hands, bruises over much of her body, and deep lacerations to the back of her head. But the cause of death was determined to be suffocation, coupled with blunt force trauma to the head. The coroner believed Lisa's attackers knocked her unconscious with a shovel and then buried her alive.
When you find out that you were that close to possibly saving this kidnapped victim from her demise, as it turned out. It hurts in that you wish you could kind of go back in time and do something different than you did. But under the conditions that we had and the information we had to work with, we felt like we did as good as we could. Unfortunately, it wasn't good enough to save Lisa.
The 4 kidnappers were tried soon after her body was found. Demetrius Hall became a witness for the state and accepted a plea bargain of 25 years. Stephen Beckley did the same and got 30 years. Orlando Hall received the death penalty for interstate kidnapping resulting in death. A few months later, Bruce Webster received the same sentence. Both were sent to death row at the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. The trials were little consolation to Lisa's sister Pearl, who could barely absorb the fact that the bright teenager would never realize her dream of becoming a surgeon.
I thought I'd feel better, but I really don't. Because, I mean, it's not going to bring her back. The only thing that's going to make it better is Lisa was here today, and she's not coming back.
For Arlington Police Detective John Stanton, Lisa Renee's murder had disturbing implications.
It just solidified the fact that things can happen to people who are completely and totally unrelated to criminal activities. No one is exempt from the possibility that, for no real reason of their own, they get put in a position where their life is in jeopardy. And Lisa Renee is a prime example of someone that, in the years that I've been doing this, she is actually probably the most innocent victim that I've ever worked a case on. And it's something that we'd all need to remember, that even if you're an innocent victim, you can still be a victim.
For Special Agent Garrett Floyd and investigators alike, the case was personal.
I have a daughter who's approximately the same age as Lisa Renee. And to believe that someone could take a child, a young lady, and do the things that they did to her and then kill her without any respect for life takes that father image in me to a different level. Because we love our children, and we know that we will have to take care and keep them out of harm's way. And on a Saturday night, if my daughter's doing homework and I happen to run to the store, they could break in my house and take my daughter and do the same thing.
In Alabama, a series of deadly assaults shocks the community and frustrates police. All the killers leave behind are the dead and fleeting images on surveillance videotape. Local police and federal agents follow the killer's trail up and down the eastern seaboard. The shadowy fugitives keep running, but the FBI will not give up the chase.
Surveillance video is often the most precise witness to a crime. Its images can speak for victims when they are unable. After 3 brutal murders were caught on tape in Alabama, the suspects fled the area. They had an arsenal of stolen weapons and swore they wouldn't be taken alive. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Racing across several states, the fugitives tried to elude the FBI, and agents hoped to capture them without more bloodshed.
In the 1990s, Birmingham, Alabama saw a drop in both its population and its crime rate. But even in the safest cities, killers can strike. On May 18th, 1996, a customer at a gas station discovered a body. Birmingham police responded to the 911 call. Crime scene investigators determined the victim, the station cashier, had been shot to death. He was the only employee on duty that day. The customer hadn't seen what happened to him. A trail of blood led back into the store and behind the counter. More blood there indicated the cashier lay briefly on the floor before going outside, perhaps hoping for help. He barely made it to the parking lot. Police first suspected a robbery shooting, but money was left on the counter, and the cash register had not been emptied. No fingerprints pointed toward a suspect, and no witnesses had seen anything. Investigators retrieved the store's security videotape and sent it to the police lab. The tape had degraded because it had been reused many times in the recorder. So the footage of the crime was blurry and few details could be seen. Police technicians tried to clean up the image electronically for detectives. The enhanced tape gave investigators a better look at the crime. It confirmed what the crime scene clues suggested. A lone customer shot the cashier, even though the employee was complying with his demands. It seemed he killed without reason. Technicians made video captures of individual frames and tried to enhance them in order to see the face of the perpetrator or any identifying characteristics. Birmingham police hoped to identify the suspect from the stills. Checking mugshots, they could not find a match. Detectives interviewed friends and relatives of the victim, trying to find some lead on the senseless murder. No one recognized the killer or knew who might want the cashier dead. Without any other evidence, the investigation stalled. 2 months later, and 20 miles south of Birmingham, a call came into the sheriff's office in Shelby County, Alabama. Sheriff James Jones received the report of 2 people down at a pawn shop.
When we got the phone call, it really wasn't clear to us exactly what had happened. We had reason to believe that lives had been lost in the building. It happened so rarely in our county that I really was surprised when I got on the scene.
EMTs determined the pawn shop owner had died from multiple gunshots. A female employee was in critical condition with a gunshot wound to her head.
All other cars, when you're outside, make sure they...
The sheriff ordered deputies to stop any suspicious vehicles in the area.
We really didn't know what we were looking for at this point. But we was in hopes that our people would be sharp enough if they saw something that was out of place that they would be able to recognize that, stop that vehicle, and perhaps give us some leads from it.
Stabilizing her as much as they could in the field, the paramedics prepared the woman for the helicopter ride to the hospital. Authorities determined more than $2,300 in cash and jewelry was missing. And the gun cases had been nearly emptied. Since the pawn shop had frequent customers, it wasn't difficult for crime scene technicians to lift hundreds of latent fingerprints. Connecting one of them to the crime might be impossible. The lead investigator was Shelby County Sergeant Michael DeHart.
There was really a lot of evidence processing to be done, fingerprint dusting, so on, but we didn't find anything definitive as a result of that. The one thing that we did find that we did have were shell casings that were left at the scene.
The murder weapon was a .380 automatic handgun.
At the time, we didn't know if this was a one-time event that had occurred or if this was part of a larger series of events.
The in-store shooting was similar to the earlier gas station murder, but this crime occurred during a robbery. Detectives checked for the shop's security video. Then they remembered something.
I was talking to the owner a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about putting a dummy machine in. He was talking about putting a real one over in this area.
Sergeant Russell Yawn found the other machine in the actual surveillance videotape.
The second, or the real VCR, continued to operate even after they took and unplugged and removed the tape from the dummy VCR. And it continued to record even until the time that I pushed the eject button.
And it's showing...
The videotape showed two young men entering the store at 3:23 p.m. They cornered the shop owner, forcing him behind the counter with the female employee. Deputies spotted a red pickup truck barely visible outside the shop. It might be the getaway vehicle. The suspects looted the pawn shop for 13 minutes while the employees watched. They then shot the hostages, point blank.
We saw nothing that told us that these two victims resisted or attempted to resist. They were very compliant. And I'm sure they did that with the hopes that they would live. But instead, their life was taken by execution style. And that was very disturbing to see that.
What I don't understand is, this is just garbage.
Sergeant Yawn and his partner, Sergeant Donald King, found more evidence near the spot where the victims had been killed.
As we were doing our search at the pawn shop, we saw a small pile of garbage in behind the counter, and we noted it at the time. Why was the garbage there? There was no garbage can. It really didn't make a whole lot of sense at the time. There was also some metal filings on the floor mixed in with the trash.
The filings likely came from a key-making machine installed on the counter. Detectives collected them for later examination. They believe the killers took the garbage can, but they didn't know why. Federal law requires that anyone buying or selling firearms must keep records of the transactions. Detectives asked another employee to bring up the store's weapons manifest, comparing it to the guns still in the shop.
Yeah, I think this is,
They realized the suspects took an entire arsenal.
Yeah, I think that's it.
There were 32 stolen weapons in the hands of vicious killers.
We was very disturbed about what else would they do, what were they doing now, and what would they do again in the future.
Because of the potential for more violence by the heavily armed killers, sheriff's detectives immediately contacted the Shelby County District Attorney's Office. Prosecutor Randy Hillman joined the investigation.
We like to be in on the front end of any investigation. It makes things a lot easier for us. It makes things a lot easier for the police officers working the scene as well.
The surveillance videotape was the best evidence investigators had to find the killers. It showed the suspects carry out many of the stolen items in a guitar case. One of them shot both the shop owner and the employee. At one point, his gun jammed. Almost mechanically, he cleared and reloaded, and then kept firing. The two suspects got into the waiting red pickup, both on the passenger side. There must have been a driver, a third suspect. Technicians made photos from video captures, but the quality was poor.
We had photographs of these individuals actually doing the execution. We had a partial photograph of the vehicle that they were in, but we didn't know who they were. And the level of violence here was critical to us. I mean, we had to stop these guys before it happened again.
Less than 8 hours after the shooting, investigators learned the pawn shop employee died in the hospital. Now there were 2 innocent murder victims. Technicians at the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences examined the bullet fragments and casings found at the pawn shop. They compared them to those used in other area shootings, including the one at the Birmingham gas station, to see if the same gun was used. But the pawn shop bullets did not match any others. Still, investigators thought the 2 crimes might be related. They turned to the public for help.
We were able to distribute still photographs to the local media in the area, and we enlisted their assistance in getting the pictures out there to the public and to request assistance in identifying the perpetrators of these crimes.
They kept several aspects of the crime secret to help identify more reliable
What's
leads.
the address on Commerce Street? Okay.
The media exposure generated dozens of calls.
Okay. How many guys were there?
One caller said that while driving in Birmingham, he saw 2 men fitting the description of the pawn shop killers. They were carrying guns and a guitar case from a red pickup into a house.
Okay.
The detail of the guitar case had been withheld from the public.
Okay, great.
The caller said he knew the men, but only by their street names, Turkey and Maine.
Hey, Mike, we just got some...
Shelby County detectives took the information to Birmingham police.
Had an informant calling with 2 guys loading up...
The Metro Department had a database on street names. Turkey was an alias for 16-year-old Marcus Presley. He resembled the shooter in the pawn shop murders. Maine was 18-year-old LaSamuel Gamble. He resembled the second pawn shop robber. The 2 had long juvenile records.
Go into the areas where the information indicates.
Through court documents, they learned where Gamble lived.
We knew that the people that we were looking for were very dangerous men. They had killed before. We were afraid that they would kill again. And so when we undertook these searches, we wanted to use every safety precaution available to us. So we used tactical, dynamic entries into the residences that we searched.
Sheriff's have a search warrant!
The arrest team cleared the house where Gamble had been living. No one was home.
Nobody in the house?
Nobody?
A pair of cold-blooded killers with an arsenal of stolen weapons remained on the loose.
Everybody's inside. We'll set up a perimeter.
Thank you. Don't see any movement?
On July 28, 1996, Alabama investigators searched for Marcus Presley, LaSamuel Gamble, and a third suspect believed to be involved in a double murder at a pawn shop. A tactical arrest team entered the house where suspect Gamble lived. but they found no one there. Armed with a warrant, detectives searched the house. Shelby County Sergeant Russell Yawn recovered evidence that directly linked the suspect to the pawn shop murders.
During the search, we found the videotape that came from the dummy VCR. It was destroyed, the case was cracked and broken, the tape pulled from the housing, and it indicated to us that they were aware that they were being recorded, and they had the presence of mind to stop and try to remove or eliminate all evidence of their crime.
They also found an empty guitar case. It appeared to be the one taken from the pawn shop. Sergeant Donald King found more evidence in the kitchen.
We were able to find a garbage can, and in the bottom of it had some labels, some price tags and so forth from some of the guns and some of the jewelry from the pawn shop. And it also contained some of the same metal shavings that we were able to tie back to the robbery scene.
Sergeant Michael DeHart was frustrated that they didn't find any of the 32 stolen weapons.
At the time that we did the search, we knew that 3 people were involved, but the third person we didn't know. When we did the search at the residence, we found a paycheck stub in a coat pocket that had the name Stephen McKenzie on it from a business in the Boston area. So paycheck stub.
Perhaps McKenzie was the third suspect who drove the getaway vehicle.
Dated fairly recently.
He had no local address, but neighbors said he was a friend of Gamble and Presley. Court records listed Marcus Presley as living with his grandmother.
There's nothing here that can directly be tied to the pawn shop.
Investigators searched that house too, but found nothing there that related to the crime.
That's 10 Forest, 1230 3rd Avenue West.
Presley's grandmother arrived home as they were executing the search warrant.
Yes, ma'am. We got a search warrant to search this residence.
Can I go in my house?
Not right now. We're doing an investigation of a robbery, but you can speak to these 2 people right here. Ma'am, I'm Chris Curry with Shelby County Sheriff's Office. Do you
Detectives showed her video captures from the robbery.
Tell me if you recognize anyone. 2 people.
She admitted one of the men looked like her grandson.
Picture, if you would, and help us and tell me if you recognize anyone.
She had tried her best to raise Marcus, but he got involved with drugs and gangs and had been in trouble ever since.
Thank you very much. You've been very helpful. But again, I apologize for the inconvenience.
She said he would disappear for weeks at a time.
But it will take him a few more minutes to finish.
She was devastated to learn that now he was a murder suspect.
You are certainly welcome to sit on the porch if you'd like.
The suspect's apparently constant movement troubled prosecutor Randy Hillman.
They were young, they were mobile, they didn't have any home base that they operated out of like normal people have a home that they go to and from. They had several different residences that they would frequent.
Detectives canvassed the neighborhood where Gamble and Presley hung out, interviewing anyone who might know the suspects. Several people in the neighborhood said that lately, Gamble and Presley had been flashing jewelry and giving away guns to members of their street gang. Some said they heard the suspects were still in the area and offered addresses where the young men might be staying. The detectives checked all the addresses. Gamble and Presley seemed to have disappeared.
We had one last place that we wanted to look before going home that particular day. We were on the way back and the suggestion was made, let's ride by the uncle of LaSamuel Gamble. Let's ride by his house and just see if anyone's there. We did that, and when we did, we saw a red pickup truck that matches the description of the vehicle that was used in the robbery.
It had no plates, but they could see the vehicle identification number. The detectives noticed a Massachusetts parking permit in the corner of the windshield.
6802746.
They hoped Gamble's uncle would have information about the suspects.
Good afternoon, sir. I want to talk to you about that red truck on the side of your house.
The uncle agreed to answer their questions, but not at his home. He did not want to be seen with the cops. They took a drive so they could talk.
Okay, Mr. Gamble, we've done.
The uncle told investigators that the truck belonged to Stephen McKenzie, a friend of his nephew. It was the same name as the one on the Boston pay stub. The uncle admitted that his nephew recently stayed at his house with McKenzie and Presley. The trio had cleared out several days ago. Sergeant Yawn believed the uncle knew details.
And at first he really didn't want to give us any useful information, but we continued, and he did admit that they had left town and they had gone to Boston.
A check of the red pickup's Massachusetts parking permit confirmed that the truck belonged to Stephen McKenzie, the suspected getaway driver.
Everything going okay?
Eventually, the uncle gave investigators permission to search his property. He suggested they look under the porch. There, police found a paint gun. The serial number on the gun matched one taken from the pawn shop. There was enough probable cause to impound McKenzie's pickup and process it for evidence. But the technicians did not find anything that tied it to the pawn shop robbery homicide. With the possibility that the suspects had left the state, Shelby County authorities contacted FBI Special Agent Jeff Newton.
They requested FBI assistance in locating suspects that they had identified as they believed to be responsible for this terrible crime. At that point, I got information from the case from the Sheriff's Department representative, realized that we had enough probable cause at that point to apply for a federal unlawful flight to avoid prosecution, or UFAP warrant.
The FBI re-interviewed the suspect's friends. They told agents Gamble and Presley were acting desperate and volatile, and that the pair had promised if the law ever caught up with them, they would not be taken alive. In Alabama, authorities struggled to find the men believed responsible for 2 robbery homicides. The state increased the reward for the capture of LeSamuel Gamble, Marcus Presley, and Stephen McKenzie to $100,000. FBI Special Agent Jeff Newton believed the suspects left Alabama for Boston.
Anybody that's a suspect in a double homicide is automatically rated at the highest priority. I immediately notified our Boston office, you got bad guys heading your way we believe or may already be there. I gave them lots of details, everything I learned from Shelby County pertaining to their level of violence, you know, what they look like. We were sending photographs, we were sending full physical descriptions.
At the Boston, Massachusetts FBI field office, Special Agent Joseph Altman received the priority call.
The 3 individuals were identified to us as vicious killers, that they had made claims to the effect that they would not hesitate to kill again, that they would not be taken alive, or that they would take the life of any law enforcement officer that attempted to stop them.
Birmingham agents also sent Boston a list of places they should investigate. One was the construction company where suspect Stephen McKenzie had worked. Agents went to speak with the owner. The man said he had not seen the suspect in weeks. If McKenzie was in the Boston area, he had not made an attempt to come back to work. The owner had an employment record, but it did not contain any new address or other information that would help find the suspect.
Great.
Boston authorities staked out the other addresses that Birmingham had sent, including one of another uncle of LaSamuel Gamble. But they did not approach this house immediately.
We did not want to let on that we were surveilling this particular home. We wanted to allow at least one or two areas, homes in the area that they could return to.
After several hours, they spotted a man leaving the residence.
Looks like him from here. They want the radio back in and tell them that someone's coming out of the house.
It was not one of the suspects. They waited until they were sure he was alone and not being watched.
How you doing, sir? I'm Special Agent Daniel and Special Agent Francis would like to ask you a couple questions if we could. All right. Do you live in that building?
He was hesitant to talk, but did say that neither Gamble's uncle nor the suspects were in the house.
No one's in there? Mark is present.
But he had seen them.
Thank you very much. Again, we just have to ask you.
He told us that both Gamble and Presley had been staying at this location, but they had since moved out. He did not know where they moved to. We felt that this location was no longer vital in our investigation, so we obtained a search warrant and searched the home and did not discover anything of lead value.
Another address on their list was in Roxbury, a suburb south of Boston. An agent set up surveillance there. It meant more long hours with no promise of a payoff. On August 1st, 1996, the Boston FBI held a press conference.
We believe these individuals to be extremely dangerous, most likely armed. They're wanted in Alabama. We'd like to bring these individuals in.
They distributed wanted posters and asked anyone with information to call a special tip line. The media campaign produced dozens of leads. One was an address outside Boston where alleged getaway driver Stephen McKenzie was said to be staying. There was no word whether Gamble and Presley were with him.
All right, let's go.
The tactical arrest team had to be prepared for a fight. They caught McKenzie off guard. But Gamble and Presley were nowhere to be found. The two fugitives remained free and on the streets with an arsenal of stolen weapons. In August of 1996, The Boston SWAT team arrested one of 3 suspects who had fled Alabama after 2 robbery homicides. The suspected getaway driver, Stephen McKenzie, was unarmed and taken in for questioning.
Good work, guys. Thanks.
Investigators searched the house where he was staying. They found jewelry, later determined to be from the Alabama pawn shop that was robbed. They also recovered 3 weapons. Running the serial numbers of the guns, agents learned they were among the 32 weapons stolen from the pawn shop.
P38, yeah. Right.
But nothing in the house indicated where LaSamuel Gamble and Marcus Presley were. Boston agents held McKenzie on a charge of receiving stolen property. They contacted prosecutor Randy Hillman in Shelby County, Alabama.
Immediately after receiving that telephone call, we got on a plane and flew to Boston to help the Boston investigators.
They hoped McKenzie could lead them to the elusive armed killers.
We knew the level of violence and the numbers of guns that they had and what a danger they posed to other people.
The Shelby County authorities interviewed McKenzie.
Mr. McKenzie, you know why we're here. Our major concern is that these weapons are going to get back out on the street, and someone else, innocent persons, are going to lose their lives.
They confronted him with the evidence they had. Hoping for sentencing leniency, the suspect began to talk.
We're sitting around or whatever and drinking, and we just decided, hey, let's do it.
He said that he, Presley, and Gamble planned the pawn shop robbery in mid-July. They drove by the shop to check it out.
Drive the car, you know, watch out. Stay
Gamble said it would be a good place to rob. There were guns, jewelry, and cash inside, and no security.
I'm positive. It was guaranteed that, you know, no one would get hurt. It was just a in and out thing.
On July 25th, they returned in McKenzie's pickup. Gamble and Presley went inside while McKenzie waited. They were only supposed to grab the money and valuables. But then McKenzie heard shots. They took what they came for, then fled.
I have a hard time believing that you don't know where they are. I know we're right there close. We're real close to them. I still think that they're real close around here.
McKenzie said Gamble and Presley had run with him to Boston.
I mean, I don't know.
And that they might still be in the area somewhere.
I'm positive.
Investigators were unconvinced.
He's not telling us everything. He's on back on us.
That's right. We'll let him sit in it for a while.
But
He claimed that he did not know where they were at the time, which I don't know that he did. He did give us some information about where they had been staying, the different houses that they may have gone to, and some other information. I think McKenzie held out on us. I think McKenzie knew more than what he was telling us.
At trial, McKenzie's testimony would be attacked. The prosecutor turned to the one unimpeachable witness, the surveillance video. He sent the tape to the FBI's audio and video processing lab in Quantico, Virginia. The task of cleaning up the footage fell to video program manager Dale Linden.
This tape was a VHS recording on a security system. It had, I would say, fairly poor quality as far as resolution. It had a backlighting issue where the camera was facing towards the windows. At some points, some of the people in this video scene looks like silhouette. As people moved around, the closer they got to the camera, the better images we were able to retrieve.
Focusing on the portions of video where the perpetrators were nearest the camera, Lyndon began enhancing the images.
Once we digitize these images, we will go through each one. And depending on what the problems are, we will apply different types of filter processes. In this particular case, the first thing we did was we did some contrast adjustments to make the images look brighter and focusing in primarily on the subjects. In this particular case, I felt that we did some improvement to get facial detail of the face and the weapons, and also their movements within the store itself.
The results strengthened the case against Gamble and Presley. Now authorities needed to catch them. The FBI continued their stakeout at a house in Roxbury, Massachusetts, where informants said the men might hide out. It was the best lead so far for FBI Special Agent Joseph Altman.
We surveilled this house for approximately 48 hours. The street information that we had was getting better and better all the time, that the individuals were holed up in this house. We thought that we saw movement in the house.
Are they ready? This is Special Agent Frasker. SWAT ready?
Field agents told the SWAT team to prepare for entry. Right before the go word was given, a man left the target house.
Excuse me, sir. How you doing?
Agents believed it was Gamble's uncle. They knew he was on probation for a felony offense. In accepting probation, a person gives up his Fourth Amendment rights. He can be stopped and searched at any time.
Oh, that's what we wanted to find out. Why don't you put them in this procedure? This all right. I don't care about your cousin. Gun!
Agents found a handgun.
This was one of the weapons that was actually stolen during the robbery in Alabama, one of the 32 weapons that were stolen. He told us that the subjects were no longer in this house. However, we felt that since he was related to the subjects and that he had a stolen weapon on him, that we could not take this information at face value. So Boston SWAT went ahead and made the entry.
Gamble and Presley had sworn never to be taken alive. So the SWAT team prepared for a shootout.
We felt that the only way that they were going to be extricated from the house was through force.
The tactical arrest team swept through the house, clearing each room as they went. No one was inside.
However, they did find some travel bags belonging to Presley and Gamble. Inside these bags were a couple of weapons, in addition to a photograph.
The photos showed the fugitives getting on a bus. The travel bags contained the shirts worn by Gamble and Presley at the pawn shop. Investigators also recovered one of the guns used in the pawn shop robbery.
Thank you, officer. Thank you very much. Come on, guys.
The uncle confirmed Gamble and Presley stayed at the house.
We found these pictures in there. Yeah, those are the guys. Who's that? Those are both of them?
He said they left on a bus for Virginia, where Gamble's girlfriend lived. The FBI and Boston police had missed the dangerous fugitives by a matter of hours. On August 5th, 1996, fugitives LeSamuel Gamble and Marcus Presley eluded an arrest team in Boston. An uncle told agents the men had left for Virginia, where one had a girlfriend, but he did not know exactly where. To narrow the search, the FBI obtained the phone records of houses in Boston where the suspects might have stayed. For nearly 48 hours, agents combed through the records, looking for common numbers. According to FBI Special Agent Joseph Altman, they found one.
We did find a common phone numbers that occurred about 2.5 months before the murders took place and about a week after the murders took place.
The number was in the Norfolk, Virginia area. Boston agents contacted the FBI's Norfolk field office. On August 8th, Special Agent John Harley received word from Boston to apprehend the young fugitives.
Youth can be a factor in making somebody a little bit more unpredictable. If they're older and more set in their ways, they may even have a past pattern of conduct that we can look at and help us in apprehending that person. But with these two individuals, as young as they were, they proved to be very difficult because they were not predictable at all.
At 5:30 the next morning, the fugitive task force arrived.
An individual came to the door who we weren't sure matched description or not initially, but we went ahead and detained him there at the door and asked if we could go ahead and consent to search his apartment, at which time he said we could.
Seen these guys? You haven't seen them before?
The resident recognized photographs of the suspects.
The individual who we talked to provided us information that he had partied recently at his apartment and that two individuals matching the description of Presley and Gamble had come with a girl that he knew.
The place was empty, but the resident gave agents the girl's address.
Time is starting to tick by, and we then have to head over to try to locate this apartment where this girlfriend is apparently living, who's associated with the two subjects.
An arrest team quickly assembled outside the target apartment, a third-story residence. Norfolk police helped cordon off the area while agents assessed the building for entry.
It's now getting to be about 9 o'clock in the morning. The sun's up now, and we were getting concerned that if the two subjects were sleeping, that they weren't going to be sleeping for very much longer, and we would prefer to go in if they were obviously not awake.
The arrest team split into two groups and moved in.
We decided to make our main effort use the most people to go up the fire escape, which isn't the most conducive route, but it was the route that we thought offered the most surprise. We also then stationed two special state police agents on the front door, which would have been in the interior hallway, just to make sure that any bad guys didn't run out.
The agents did not have the time to obtain a search warrant for the apartment. To get inside and make a legal arrest, they would have to see the suspects or get permission. They spotted a resident through a back window and took a risk.
We announced to him who we were and that we were looking for a couple of individuals and asked if he minded if we took a look around. This older gentleman then stepped aside, nodded, "Come on in," and that's when we made our entry.
They found Presley first.
We immediately handcuff him and detain him.
He had no opportunity to warn his friend. In a rear bedroom, the team found Gamble. The agents positively identified Presley and Gamble from photographs and placed them under arrest. U.S. Marshals transported the fugitives back to Shelby County, Alabama. When questioned at the county jail, Samuel Gamble blamed Presley for the murders. When they spoke to Marcus Presley, he had a different story. Each believed they had destroyed the surveillance tape.
Presley and Gamble both still thought that there was nobody alive from the robbery who could say exactly what happened. They continued to point the finger at each other, saying, he's the one that did it, or it wasn't me, it was someone else, until they saw the videotape. Once they saw the videotape, they realized that no longer could they lie about it, that we had them actually doing the executions. And the whole tenor of the conversation changed then. Eventually, Marcus Presley, after pointing the finger several other places, Presley confessed and said that he did do the killing.
How about this?
Presley also confessed to another crime. He had been the shooter in the gas station murder in Birmingham. He said he thought the cashier was going for a gun, so he shot him. In 1997, the three suspects had separate trials. For his role, Stephen McKenzie received 50 years. An Alabama jury convicted Samuel Gamble of capital murder and sentenced him to death for being part of the pawnshop slayings. Marcus Presley received the death penalty for killing the gas station cashier. Another jury sentenced him to death a second time for killing the pawn shop employees.
When the jurors saw this tape, they were shocked. People are used to seeing violence on television, and we've seen so much of it that you kind of become detached, that it becomes old hat to you. This was an actual videotape of two people being executed, and it had a profound impact on the jury. Actually, the owner of the pawn shop was an unwitting participant in the investigation of his own murder. By having the dummy VCR and putting that tape in our hands, showing the actual executions, he helped us solve this case a lot more quickly and with conviction, with absolute certainty. Whereas if we hadn't had this tape, it would have been a guessing game.